Control is a 2019 action-adventure game developed by Remedy Entertainment. Those of you familiar with my channel may already know that I'm a big fan of Remedy's penchant for weirdness and meta-narrative, so I guess it comes as no surprise that this video happened.
I was in a computer game.
In some ways, it's one of the most me games that someone could make. A moody meta-narrative with noir affectations set in the brutalist offices of a backwater federal agency that studies supernatural phenomena featuring a monologist protagonist with a mysterious past. Remedy, don't get me wrong, I feel super flattered, but you could have just asked instead of intercepting my private conversations. Wait, is monologist even a word? Let me check. Looks like it is. Whew. Anyways, Control does not only provide a fascinating story reinforced by some of the best world building this medium has to offer, it's also, dare I say, extremely fun to play. That's thanks to Control's suite of upgradable paranatural powers coupled with the game's destructive environments. Control was one of the first games released to take advantage of real-time ray tracing. And while I'm not one to gush at graphics and fancy effects, I have to admit that this technology really adds value to the game beyond eye candy. The game wouldn't feel right without ray tracing. Before we move on to the actual video, I have to do something I never thought would be necessary with a game not 4 years old. Recommend fixes. So you may be aware of the fact that Control has issues with textures loading slowly. Textures appear blurry and load fully after a long while, even when directly facing the player. Initially, only props like paintings and signs seem to be affected by slow texture loading. So I shrugged it off as, you know, one of the inevitable compromises of developing a AAA game on a $36 million budget. But then, I noticed this issue spilling over into other areas, like surfaces and objects. The moment I saw half-loaded Ahti reaching out to me from beyond texture limbo, I decided enough was enough and started looking for solutions. First, I looked at the system requirements. Check. Pausing and resuming the game was suggested as a workaround. Did not work for me. Same thing goes for lowering texture resolution, which is supposed to prevent the game from crowding GPU memory or something like that. Nope. Eventually, I found this Reddit guide, which recommends installing a couple of small patches and editing the config file. For some mysterious reason, this also didn't work for me. By that point, I was ready to scrap the video entirely because the slow texture loading was simply too distracting. Fortunately, I was inspired enough to scroll down to this obscure 4-month-old comment from a deleted account running the game on the same GPU as me, who recommends changing a specific value in the config file from 500 to 2048, and it worked like a charm. The relief I felt, you have no idea. So, deleted user, if by some miracle you're watching this, thank you so much for your tip. This video literally could not have existed without your assistance. One more thing. This video will cover just the base game and I will avoid referencing the two expansions, the Foundation and AWE, to the best of my abilities. I considered dedicating an entire section to Control's DLC, but I realized that I don't have anything interesting to add to the discussion. This tweet pretty much sums up my thoughts about the DLC. However, since AWE officially connects the Alan Wake and Control universes together, I am curious to see if the FBC is going to play a part in Alan Wake 2's story. And yes, that's me confirming an Alan Wake 2 video will happen. I don't know when, but it will surely happen. Anyways, let's get this video started.
I'm sorry, I'm talking too much. This whole situation is just a lot.
Control's story revolves around the Federal Bureau of Control, a secret US government agency that investigates paranatural phenomena, or altered world events, according to FBC lingo. These AWEs, which are caused and affected by the human collective unconscious, have a variety of effects on the world, including the creation of objects of power. Think of these objects of power as stalker artifacts, but more abstract. They're basically archetypal items that grant users specific powers and abilities. The objects of power and everything I've mentioned until now, for that matter, are connected to the board, a celestial, impenetrable, inverted black pyramid-shaped bureaucracy residing in the astral plane, an alternate dimension. The individual chosen by the board to wield the service weapon, itself an object of power, becomes the director of the FBC by default. I know, it's a lot, but don't worry, it gets even more complicated. The game itself takes place within the offices of the Oldest House, a brutalist skyscraper in New York City that serves as the headquarters of the FBC. The Oldest House is no ordinary building. For one, the Oldest House is visible only to FBC employees and preternaturally sensitive individuals. Secondly, and more crucially, the Oldest House is a place of power, a location that has been impacted by preternatural forces and thus operates under its own logic, far removed from the laws of our reality. We'll talk more about the Oldest House in its dedicated section. We assume the role of Jesse Faden, who is chosen by the board to lead the agency after the recent death of Director Trench. Jesse arrives at the Oldest House following a telepathic message seeking the whereabouts of her brother Dylan, who was kidnapped by the agency 17 years prior to the game's events. The short version is that Jesse and Dylan were involved in an altered world event of catastrophic proportions in their hometown of Ordinary, Maine. After discovering an object of power in the form of a slide projector, the two children accidentally activated the artifact, which caused Ordinary's adult population to vanish. Upon being made director, Jesse is attacked by agents who have been corrupted by an entity called the Hiss, and discovers that the Oldest House has been under emergency lockdown to contain the Hiss's spread. Now Jesse, as the director of the very agency that kidnapped her brother, is in the awkward position of having to combat a crisis of potentially apocalyptic proportions that could spill over from the offices of the Oldest House to the outside world if not contained. There's more to this, of course. For a new IP, Control provides stupid amounts of lore in the form of redacted documents and audio logs, which is why I thought exploring the FBC and the Oldest House in their dedicated sections instead of filing the entirety of Control's world building under a generic settings section is the right approach here. It wasn't my idea though. My dear friend and fellow YouTuber Arkham, whose Control analysis I highly recommend you watch, has likened Control's story to a triangle. One corner for Jesse, one for the Oldest House, and one for the FBC. I fully agree with his way of doing things, which is why I'm gonna use this structure moving forward. Mostly, I don't wanna spoil the story, so I'll avoid talking about Jesse too much.
Take a mystery pill because a rude lady in a hazmat suit tells you to. Great idea, Jesse.
I think it comes as no surprise that the Oldest House is a lot more than its unassuming name suggests. Similar to its real-life counterpart in Inspiration, which is 33 Thomas Street, formerly known as the AT&T Long Lines building, the only thing that makes it stand out in a New York City skyline dominated by Art Deco and neoclassical styles is its brutalist design. It's the kind of building that makes you go, huh, wonder how that got there. That's assuming the Oldest House was visible to ordinary people in the first place. Or to put it more accurately, if it wanted to be seen by ordinary people. Because the Oldest House is very much alive. A monstrous, windowless, concrete behemoth with an agenda of its own. Its wants and intentions are not something we ordinary people can comprehend. Because the Oldest House doesn't subscribe to our laws of reality. For one, the Oldest House is larger on the inside than it appears on the outside. The interior of the Oldest House is a constantly shifting labyrinth defying all the laws of physics and geometry known to humanity. Secondly, its interiors are connected to various alternate dimensions via thresholds, which are basically spontaneously occurring locations that connect Earth to alternate dimensions. Thirdly, the Oldest House seems to possess a preternatural connection to the board and the astral plane. The building's shifting topography, coupled with its connections to multiple dimensions, led the FBC to conclude that the Oldest House is infinite in scale, with the space controlled by the agency only a fraction of the building's true extent. It's very scary, this prospect of a sentient space, if you can even call it that, whose origin, makeup and intentions are beyond human logic. Even the crumbs of information that the FBC has uncovered, though scientifically sound, come with an asterisk attached because really no one truly knows what the fuck the Oldest House is all about. I'm obviously not gonna cover every single detail, so the TLDR version is that in 1964 the FBC was investigating an AWE in the New York City subway tunnels when they stumbled across an entrance to the the oldest house. In effect, what they discovered was the foundation, the only structurally static part of the oldest house. And so, the skyscraper became perceptible to FBC employees, and the board assumed control of the FBC via its connection with the director. The Bureau eventually converted the oldest house into its base of operations after discovering that the control points, basically physical coordinates that the board uses to access the building, can be used to contain the shifts. Agency reports liken these control points to ley lines that run throughout the oldest house. To get an idea, think of the ley lines that certain individuals from the fringes of the scientific community believe serve as guides for alien spacecraft. Anyways, directors, through a combination of science and ritual, use these control points to stabilize local areas within the oldest house, ensuring a relatively safe and shift-free work environment. Without the control points, the oldest house would swallow everything, trapping its inhabitants in endless labyrinths. It's thanks to these control points that the oldest house, or at least the section that the Bureau inhabits, has a semblance of normalcy. It's what allowed subsequent directors to establish relatively safe areas for research, containment, and bureaucracy, and build the Bureau into an organization with international reach, with the manpower and resources to lead what is an otherwise specific battle against the paranormal, which is always one step ahead. The oldest house is a space where the mundane clashes with the weird. If a visitor were to take a stroll through the Bureau's offices, they'd see nothing more than a government agency stuck in the past. They'd get the same feeling as, say, walking into a postal office in 2023 and overhearing a fax machine taking its last breath in the back room. You'd think the presence of 60s and 70s technology such as pneumatic tubes, landlines, slide projectors, and monochrome monitors is just representative of, governments being notoriously slow at adopting new technology in general, but that's not actually the case. The absence of modern-day technology is actually the result of newer technology malfunctioning within the boundaries of the oldest house, sometimes even leading to fatalities amongst the staff. That still doesn't explain the tacky mid-century interior design, furnishings, and fixtures. I assume it was the Bureau being like, well, since we have to fuck around with analog technology from 60 years ago anyway, we may as well go all in and really give this place a sort of middle-aged, divorced advertising executive apartment from the 60s vibe. Anyways, this element of mundanity to the Bureau's offices is why the crazy stuff stands out even more. Let's talk about thresholds. In simplest terms, thresholds are locations acting as connections between Earth and parallel dimensions. They're the result of paranatural phenomena and appear spontaneously, often at a rate that makes it hard for the Bureau's research division to keep up. Bureau agents called Rangers are sent to perform reconnaissance and map the topography of thresholds. As you can imagine, it doesn't always go as planned. One theory that I haven't considered but stumbled across while researching this video is that Earth itself is a threshold leading to the oldest house. Now that's a theory of existential bordering on Lovecraftian implications that I'm not surprised the Bureau is actively suppressing. Like, imagine being a new agency hire, still green, still grappling with the existence of the supernatural, and Jason from HR joins you at the water cooler and goes, "Yo, word on the street is that Earth is like a facet of the oldest house. We might not even be like real. Kinda weird, huh?" Also, any reason why you didn't join last week's team building event? There are 3 known thresholds within the oldest house: the quarry threshold, the mold threshold, and the clock threshold. Now, I'm not going to talk about them at length, but my god, they're so fucking weird and interesting. This is exactly why the oldest house was a brilliant place to set the game in, because it allowed Remedy to go all out on designing spaces around the craziest ideas they could come up with. Like, just look at this place, man. This is the quarry threshold. The Bureau uses the quarry to mine, yes, you heard me right, mine for black rock, material sought out by the agency due to its ability to negate paranatural effects. See those goofy things agents wear on their chests? Those are called hadron resonance amplifiers, and they require black rock prisms to function and prevent agents from being corrupted by the hiss. The reason why the Bureau is able to mine for precious materials in a quarry underneath a freaking New York City skyscraper in the first place is because, being a threshold, it's connected to an alternate dimension, which also also explains that absolutely beautiful night sky. Hell, it might be from a different planet or even galaxy, who the hell knows. And the mundanity of having to ride an industrial elevator to reach it doesn't demystify the quarry, it makes it even more interesting in my opinion. As for the clock threshold, it's a threshold full of clocks. I have absolutely nothing to add here, you'll have to see it for yourself. The most interesting threshold has to be the Ocean View Motel and Casino, a name which I'm 70% sure Remedy chose to confuse the hell out of both Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines and Arctic Monkeys fans. Anyways, as usual, I don't even know how to interpret this place. Even the Bureau is confused as to its nature and purpose. Here's what we know for certain. For one, it seems to be a place of power connecting various dimensions. Secondly, it's impossible to enter or leave it by any means other than free pulls of a light switch cord. Thirdly, while the motel seems to have an infinite number of rooms leading to God knows where, visitors are only capable of returning to other areas of the oldest house. And that's all the Bureau knows about it. Some speculate the motel may be a physical location rather than a construct in the astral plane, but the agency hasn't been able to locate it so far, and not for a lack of trying. Its discovery in 1992 following an Altered World event in Montana sent the agency on a wild goose chase that involved surveying all motels across the United States. It's clear that the motel operates on a dream logic. As you can see in this blueprint, the motel's layout makes no sense. It looks more like the idea of a motel than an actual motel, if that makes any sense. Anyways, I have two theories regarding the motel, but don't expect anything original, my imagination is incredibly limited. My first theory is that the motel is a transitional space. Motels, hotels, waiting rooms and the like are by definition liminal spaces. They're where you stop and wait for the next phase of whatever to start. In universe, the motel could be a place where the oldest house dumps visitors while it's configuring the areas beyond the motel. But in a meta-narrative game design sense or whatever, since the motel leads only to other areas of the oldest house, perhaps it's an interactive loading screen? I say interactive because Jesse always has to solve a puzzle to get out. The puzzle solving could be the new reading an old magazine in the dentist's waiting room. I don't know, food for thought I guess. My second theory is that the motel is not a motel at all, but the closest representation our fallible human brains can visualize of whatever cosmic liminal construct that space actually is. Anyway, that's my take in a nutshell. Quick aside. While researching the motel, I stumbled into a very interesting piece of trivia. Apparently, it's an homage to an obscure miniseries with a similar premise called The Last Room, starring Peter Krause of 6 Feet Under fame and Frank Sobotka from The Wire. And this dude, who you've probably seen in a zillion TV shows and can still never place, is that Juliana Skiff from The Sopranos? Spud from Trainspotting? Anyways, the titular room is a non-existent room at an abandoned hotel in Gallup, New Mexico that was created following the event, with capital E. You got your mundane objects touched by the paranormal, which grants users different powers, alternate dimensions, and yeah, you get the idea. It's Control. The series was panned by critics. Still, I kinda wanna watch it, so let me know in the comments if it's worth the time investment. See what I did there?
Dream like haze.
The second aspect of Control's story is the FBC as an organization and its agents. But before talking about the institution and its people, we need to address the board. Earlier, I described it as an inverted pyramid entity, but that's not exactly accurate as the board doesn't have a shape. The board is essentially an amalgamation of unseen paranatural entities which exist within the astral plane. The astral plane is an alternate dimension accessible via a form of astral projection upon interacting with objects of power. Its form of communication is very bizarre. Reddit user Robots914 put it beautifully when they said that the board isn't so much speaking in words as it's sending concepts and ideas directly. Here's an idea. When we speak, we express abstract concepts and ideas through words whose meaning has been established throughout generations of cultural and linguistic consensus. Because the board isn't human, it's obviously unfamiliar with that consensus. So its form of communication is effectively language in its rawest, most unfiltered form. A semiotician would have a field day with this. The board is Control's most fascinating and unsettling idea. While its nature is unknown, I like to think of it as bureaucracy itself. Literally, a celestial bureaucracy that evokes ritual and repetitiveness. This theory starts making more sense when you take a look at the FBC and how it operates. The FBC is a highly bureaucratized institution, almost to a comical degree. While on a surface level the game might seem like it's about navigating the oldest house's labyrinthine corridors, what you're actually navigating is Control's bureaucracy. This is not an original take by any means. Cameron Kuzelman's excellent write-up for Vice.com goes into great detail on the FBC and its relationship with the board. While I wouldn't necessarily place Control within the horror genre, I'd argue that its bureaucracy is its own kind of horror. Control's suffocating bureaucracy is unsettling just by virtue of how uncannily formal it is given the context. The FBC's purpose is to document, analyze, study, and contain paranatural phenomena, right? So to see these reports documenting paranormal events with the same deadpan, pragmatic style of I don't know, email ordering office supplies is kind of unsettling. Witnessing a paranormal event would be a life-changing experience for us. For the FBC, it's just Tuesday. Or maybe the bureaucracy is a sort of subtle institutional strategy to shield employees from the horrors they're witnessing on a daily basis. I don't know. As a quick aside, this bureaucratic theme was one of the reasons behind Remedy's adoption of brutalism. Bureaucracy involves rules, ritualism, and repetition, and these ideas find expression in the architecture. Remedy also looked at Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, one of my favorite movies of all time, for inspiration. They used that movie as a reference to define the Bureau's organizational culture as well as the interior decorations. And it's this notion of repetition evoked by the Bureau's suffocating bureaucracy and its interiors that creates a continuing sense of dread to the player while exploring the Bureau's offices. Like, the institution itself is a force of nature, and you're nothing compared to its impenetrable bureaucracy, no more important than a redacted blurb on some forgotten report. Additionally, the FBC has a rigid hierarchy. There's the director, who oversees everything with the drive of a micromanagement-obsessed goblin, the research division that enjoys a lot of ethical leeway in their research efforts, and a huge amount of support staff that makes sure everything is running smoothly. From my conversations with FBC employees, like my friend Arkham, I got a feeling that they're not super aware of the danger they're facing. Emily Pope, the newly made head of research following the disappearance of her predecessor, Dr. Darling, is a great example in this sense. She's so enthusiastic about this stuff. Or Langston, who's in charge of the Bureau's collection of altered items and objects of power. Dude's job is to literally calm paranatural items down by invoking esoteric rituals. To get a sense of what Langston's job involves, he's in charge of something called fridge duty. This is a containment procedure which involves assigning agents to stare at a refrigerator altered item. The only FBC employee who seems to be at least partially aware of the danger is Simon Arish, the security chief of the maintenance sector. He outright admits he enjoys the thrill of his job and would never take a desk assignment for that reason. He's also my favorite character from Control. He's funny, outgoing, reliable, respectful, and a stand-up dude overall. I love him. In fact, Control's cast of characters in general is excellent and conveys a lot of personality to what is otherwise a pretty drab government agency. That's thanks to the great voice acting and direction, a staple of Remedy products at this point. Sex and the City alumni, the legendary voice of Max Payne, James McCaffrey, plays the obsessive director Trench, with his characteristic affectation of a person who has injected 100 years worth of noir media into their bloodstream. Matthew Porretta, aka Alan Wake, plays Dr. Casper Darling, an eccentric, cheerful, and mostly good-natured scientist whose pursuit of knowledge leads to many ethically questionable experiments. I could go on, but I think that's a reasonable sized sample of Control's great cast of supporting characters. Anyway, let's talk gameplay.
Dude has got some crazy stories.
While Control is objectively Remedy's biggest game to date, it's worth noting that this is not their first jab at the open world format. Alan Wake was originally developed as an open world survival game in an attempt to offset the linearity of the Max Payne games. But after a 3-year struggle to merge the planned open world format with the cinematic psychological story they wanted to tell, Remedy shelved the open design and reworked Alan Wake to be a more traditional linear game, with the twist that its story would be told in an episodic format that better suited the narrative. The narrative was not only delivered in an episodic format, it was also framed as a TV show, with cliffhangers, previously on recaps and the like. Ironically, the episodic approach, which was a compromise, would go on to be one of Alan Wake's most notorious features, mirroring what happened to Max Payne, whose graphic novel cutscenes were, you guessed it, a compromise. This historical context is important to note because it gives us a better understanding of Control's place in the Remedy canon. Control didn't appear out of a vacuum, it's the game that Remedy had been building up to since the studio's inception. Control also marks a major turning point for Remedy, even more so than Quantum Break's cross-media ambitions, because Control is, for all intents and purposes, Remedy's first traditional AAA product, a product unhindered or scaled down in production by various limitations, and I couldn't be more happy for them. This industry desperately needs ambitious, independent studios like Remedy that push the boundaries of this medium. So Control is a third-person shooter built in the Metroidvania format. Unlike Remedy's previous titles, which were mostly linear, Control features a large open world map that can be explored and uncovered at a non-linear pace. As the player completes the main story missions, they gradually unlock new areas known in-game as sectors, with each sector acting as a branch of the Bureau's activity. For example, the executive sector serves as the administrative center of the building, home to the director's office, the communications department, the cafeteria, and so on. The maintenance sector hosts the building's plumbing, electricity, and other essential facilities. The containment sector is where the Bureau, contains dangerous altered items and objects of power. Research is where research is being done. Anyway, you get the idea. Control's game world is very tight mechanically and thematically speaking. It does a great job selling the idea of the oldest house being not just a video game space, but the headquarters of an organization that's effectively the only thing keeping the paranatural at bay. In true Metroidvania fashion, Control's world is built with backtracking in mind. The way exploration works in Control is that it gates new areas behind puzzles, security clearances, and abilities, all obtained at various points in the story. The progression is firmly non-linear. For example, while Executive is the first sector you visit, it has several high security clearance rooms that can be accessed only later in the story. The same principle applies to puzzles, whose solution requires the player unlocking and using certain abilities. The reason for sectors being locked out is twofold. For one, the oldest house is under emergency lockdown following the Hiss's spread. Secondly, the Hiss have captured control points, aka the nodes preventing the oldest house from collapsing into a cosmic chasm, and only Jesse as the director can reclaim them. It's a pretty neat justification for why Jesse, the highest ranking member of the Bureau, has to personally handle these problems. Well, that and the fact that she's looking for a brother, so yeah. Control points are more than physical locations that hold the oldest house together. They're actually instrumental to progression. Think of them as bonfires in what was that game called? Unlit Lives? Shadowy Souls? It's on the tip of my tongue. It's also where Jessie unlocks powers, abilities, weapons, and upgrades. Speaking of Jessie, there's something to be said about how she reacts to the happenings transpiring around her. If Control followed typical storytelling conventions, Jessie would have been absolutely shocked and horrified by everything. And I wouldn't blame her. Have you actually seen this place? It's fucking crazy. Not Jessie. She's not so much taking the oldest house's horrors in stride as she's... how do I put this? She feels right at home in the oldest house. The matter-of-factness with which she treats the building's weirdness doesn't feel forced because it's offset by the sense of curiosity and wonder she manifests. I've seen some people argue that Jessie's attitude made them feel disconnected from her, which I get, but let's be real for a second. It's not like Jessie hadn't been made privy to the existence of the paranormal before. Remember, she triggered an AWE that depopulated an entire town. The oldest house is just what she already knew, but on a larger scale. Plus, imagine how insufferable the game would have been if Jesse had commented on every single little thing. I'm looking at you, AAA games from the last decade. I believe the disconnect would have been even bigger had the writers made Jesse horrified and shocked by the oldest house because, when fully spec'd, she becomes an absolute paranatural beast. To paraphrase my friend Arkham, as Jesse gains experience, you slowly realize how silly this notion of the oldest house being a force of nature that Jesse has to tame sounds. It's actually the other way around. The oldest house is the one that has to keep up with Jesse, which is why Control was by far the most fun I've had with a game in the last years. A fully upgraded Jesse is able to fly, dash, hurl deadly projectiles at hiss, and slam into the ground with devastating effects to the enemy. I always thought of Jesse as being a shark, a predator that has to keep moving forward in order to survive. That's a pretty accurate way to describe the game's flow. Similar to Max Payne 2, it's not meant to be played as a cover-based shooter. You need to be constantly on the move and make yourself as hard to hit as possible. There are two layers to Control's moment-to-moment gameplay: the paranatural powers and the gunplay. Let's start with the powers. Control offers 5 different psychic powers. Launch, basically Control's version of telekinesis. Evade, which is used to quickly evade attacks and get an extra forward boost when jumping or levitating. Shield, which is pretty self-explanatory. Seize, an ability that turns low health enemies into allies for a limited time before they die. And Levitate, again pretty self-explanatory. Now granted, 5 psychic powers is not a whole lot. However, this is offset by the upgrades, which have a truly transformative effect on the powers. For instance, a fully upgraded launch lets Jesse hold and launch low health enemies and large objects, hurl grenades and rockets back at the hiss, and hold and launch up to 3 objects. The chaos and destruction this power alone causes, even at lower levels, is just astonishing. I'm not a graphics guy by any definition, but I highly recommend you turn RTX on if your system allows it. The eye candy is just delicious. Another example of the transformative effect that upgrades have on powers is Levitate, whose skill tree branches out into Ground Slam. Basically, Jessie slams herself into the ground to cause AoE damage. Now, I haven't messed around with Seize a whole lot because in my case it ruined the flow of combat, as it required me to take a brief pause from the carnage and consciously scan the arena for enemies with low health. To quote Harrier Dubois, it cramped my style. It's a neat power though, just unsuited to my playstyle. It's also worth mentioning that these powers are unlockables and gated behind either main or side missions. The player obtains them by taming/cleansing their respective objects of power, which is a pretty clever way of merging gameplay and world building. It's also when Control's most outlandish concepts and trippy visuals are on full display. Obtaining these powers is a whole process, the reason for which it always feels earned. Allow me to cite Levitate as an example once again. Levitate is obtained by binding the object of power known as the Benikoff TV. Cleansing it involves chasing it through this trippy, kaleidoscopic-like tunnel thingy formation it dug upon Jesse's attempt at touching it, defeating a boss, interacting with the TV and projecting yourself into the astral plane, and completing the astral plane challenge using Levitate. The second layer is the gunplay. In a move that surprised me, Remedy chose not to give players a selection of different firearms, but one weapon called the service weapon. The kicker is that the service weapon is a shape-shifting firearm that can assume 6 forms. Interestingly, the game implies that the service weapon was not always a firearm, that it simply takes the form of whatever the public perceives as an appropriate personal weapon in a given era. For example, if the game took place in medieval times, the service weapon would be a longbow or a dagger. Eastern Europe circa 2006, you can bet your ass the service weapon would take the form of a carbide cannon. The default form of the service weapon is grip, a standard sidearm form similar to a revolver. It's a single-shot, high-accuracy form suitable for most encounters. Subsequent forms can be constructed later once Jesse has gathered enough materials and source points. Each of the service weapon's forms corresponds to a real-life weapon. Shatter is a short-ranged medium blast form similar to a shotgun. The Spin's rapid-fire low-accuracy behavior resembles a submachine gun. Pierce is a form that charges a powerful single shot that strikes through enemy armor and cover. It's effectively a sniper rifle. There is also Charge and Surge, but I've barely used them, so I have nothing to say about them. They're basically grenade launchers. The list of intriguing design decisions regarding the gunplay doesn't end with the forms. In another twist, all forms tap into the same ammo pool and have cooldowns. Psychic powers don't have cooldowns, but they consume energy, basically mana. I think you know where I'm going with this. This weapon cooldown powers fueled by mana dynamic incentivizes synergistic play. And while you can switch between powers at will, you can only carry 2 forms at a time. I'm not sure how I feel about this, but I understand why Remedy did it. Since switching back and forth between firearms and powers and resource conservation are essential to survival, you'll have to periodically workshop suitable forms powers combos, like equipping Pierce if you're a heavy Seize user, or leaving Shatter behind if you like to ground slam Hiss. Granted, this becomes less relevant the more you advance through the story, as Jesse's psychic abilities become so powerful towards the end of the story that they render the service weapon almost obsolete. Energy conservation also becomes a non-issue because with Launch's final upgrade, energy recovers while holding objects. Plus, by the final act, when I'd beefed up Launch to the max, the service weapon was a distant memory, harkening back to a darker time when I was incapable of ripping out 3 gigantic blocks of hard fucking concrete from the oldest house's cosmic carcass and throwing them at Hiss with my brain. Like, why would I use the service weapon when everything, be it furniture, decorations, and even bodies, can be a weapon with the simple wave of a hand? Why would I bother lining up shots with Pierce when I can fucking ground slam?
And while you could force yourself to use the assimilate skill to mind control a gag or poor Blatz, why bother when you can chuck masonry at these shitheads like Ben Grimm trying to donate semen?
Yeah, exactly! What? In fact, Control's over-reliance on psychic powers to the detriment of the surface weapon is my biggest criticism. I hope Remedy will address this imbalance in the sequel because the service weapon is too cool of a concept to be overshadowed by the psychic powers. Speaking of things that need addressing in Control 2, please, for the love of God, fix the looting/crafting system. Okay, for a bit of context, in Control you can craft or find mods for the service weapon. There's nothing necessarily wrong with it, and that's exactly my biggest gripe with it. It's so standard. It's mostly just boring percentage increases. No mods to make the service weapon, I don't know, shoot electric bullets or whatever. On that same note, please make the mods menu easier to navigate. I can barely tell these things apart. The next bit, which I didn't know where to place, so I'll just dump it here, will sound confusing because it's part praise, part criticism. So, being an open game, this was Remedy's first true jab at integrating side missions and subplots. For the most part, the side quests are interesting, narratively speaking. Control's side quests do a great job of filling in the gaps that the main story left open for pacing considerations and fleshing out the world. There's one side quest where Langston, the Panopticon supervisor, tasks you with recovering escaped altered items before the Hiss fully corrupts them. What struck me about this quest was how viciously it subverted my expectations. See, my first impression of Langston was of an awkward, meek, ambitionless employee who had struck gold by landing a well-paid, low-effort management position as the supervisor of a department that sees little to no activity. I thought the altered items escaping and him tasking me with their recovery spoke to his incompetence, but that's not the case at all. Langston is actually a very competent worker and displays a lot of passion for his role at the Panopticon, so much so that he constantly proposed new, forward-thinking containment procedures for the items, only to be rejected by Trench and the Bureau's higher-ups, who were opposed to any sort of reform. And the Bureau's opposition to reform is what helped the items escape in the first place. This makes Langston, despite his penchant for rambling and metaphors, one of the most unexpectedly relatable characters in Control. Through Langston, we get a personal perspective of the Bureau's rigid bureaucracy. Now, despite its clever commentary on employee institutional dynamics, this side quest is still, in essence, a fetch quest. A fetch quest that upon completion is followed up by another identical fetch quest. And you can apply this template to all the side quests. Clever setup and writing followed by busy work. I loved hearing Dr. Underhill explaining the genetical intricacies of the mold-like organism that turns people into zombies upon ingestion, but fuck me if I enjoyed collecting mold samples. Arish, I love you like a brother and I feel for your homies, but there's no way I'm backtracking to old areas to put them out of their misery. Wow, I actually feel kinda bad now. I'm sorry, Arish. Please forgive me, Arish. That said, Control was the most fun I've had with a game in recent memory. The spectacle provided by the combat, enhanced by the incredible physics effects and destructible environments, is something to behold. The game's Metroidvania design not only increases its replay factor, but also lends credibility to the oldest house as a setting. And finally, the story is a clever exploration of the complicated dynamics between bureaucracy and people, wrapped in an intriguing supernatural thriller. Thanks for watching. As always, a huge thank you to my wonderful patrons whose generosity makes these videos possible. I'll see you next time.